Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is the author of two historical fiction novels, Falling Through the New World and The Last Whaler. Her name is Cynthia Reeves, and here's my interview with Cynthia. Cynthia Reeves, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, I've been a writer for about 30 years. I started writing poetry initially, which I think is what feeds the lyricism of my prose. I switched over to fiction writing in the early 2000s, and I've been writing ever since. I have an MFA from Warren Wilson College's low-res MFA program, which I got in 2006. And I have two books coming out this year, or that have come out. One has come out, Falling Through the New World, came out in February. And that one I've been working on for 20 years. I started writing these stories back in the early 2000s and wrote them over the years, finally finished them about a year ago. And the other book is called The Last Whaler, which is set in Svalbard in the 1930s. That book started as the inspiration was from a 2017 Arctic Circle expedition that circumnavigated Svalbard. And I was inspired by the Arctic setting and some other things that we can talk about if you'd like to write that book.
I'll start with Falling Through the New World without spoiling too much of it. What is it about, and is it more proper to classify it as a novel or a short story collection?
That's a good question. I call it a novel in stories. It's a specific form in which the linked stories, in my view, form more than just interconnectedness based on characters sharing place or the same set of characters. This actually spans a century, starting in World War I Italy and ending in 2018 America. And it goes chronologically through 4 generations of an Italian-American family. And so it gives you a sense of a novel, but without the continuity, the rising arc, climax, falling action of a traditional novel. And I did start out with that form in mind. And in fact, when I started writing the first stories during my MFA program, I was discouraged by one of my teachers from writing a novel in stories. He said to me, "Why not just write a novel?" And for some reason, I never envisioned this for several different reasons, one of which is just the time span that occurs, and also the different characters whose lives I wanted to delve in more deeply at each stage of the century, let's just say, as opposed to following just a couple of characters through a long arc of their lives. So again, I call it a novel in stories. Some people might say more broadly it's a linked collection like Olive Kitteridge or The Things They Carried or Winesburg, Ohio. Those sorts of books are sort of the grandfathers of my collection.
Now, as you wrote kind of a novel in stories, how did you go about linking multiple generations of one family while writing Falling Through the New World?
Well, actually, it's funny. I had ideas about individual stories. The collection is in 4 parts. And the third part deals with the third generation of women, and specifically a woman called Rose, who is taking care of her paralyzed father. That was actually the first story I wrote. It's set in 1965. So I skipped around. I wrote then the early stories, which are set in World War I Italy, and had to do a substantial amount of research in order to write those stories, because I knew some general ideas about where I wanted that group of stories to go, but I didn't have enough familiarity with World War One and more specifically Italy in World War One, to write the background to those stories to make them feel authentic. And so uh, I once I had that research down, I sort of wrote those in a row so that I wouldn't lose the impact of having done that research. Um, some of the last stories I wrote, again out of sequence, were another story from the third generation, the third part, and the final story, which was a story set in Italy, where the fourth generation woman, whose name is Kate, returns to Italy and has, she is the character most in search of returning to some sort of faith or spirituality. The Catholic faith intertwines all of these generations, and she sort of lost her faith. And so she returns to a place that she had taken her mother, a shrine called Il Volto Santo, which is a holy face of Christ that is preserved in Montepello, which is a little town in Italy. And so she returns there in search of the same kind of faith that her mother had when they visited together. And her mother was so moved by this shrine that she had tears in her eyes and she touched it, knowing that her mother had been there, that sort of connection along the three generations of women. And that was something that moves her finally at the that point in her life, let's just say, that there is some connection there. The very last gesture in the story shows that. And so that was the last story I wrote, mainly because I felt my own mother had died. And it took me about 10 years after her death to finally understand what I was trying to say. I always had a notion of writing that story, but I just didn't know what the story was. And both after her death and having thought about what she meant to me and what that visit meant to me, I was able to write that story in honor of my mother, to some extent, but it is fictional. I never did go back to Montebello uh, to revisit that time and place in my life.
Without spoiling too much of your upcoming historical fiction novel, The Last Whaler, what will it be about and when will it be released?
That one is going to be released in September of this year. And it actually, in terms of having two books in one year, was just a fluke. The one book, Falling Through the New World, took only about 9 months from acceptance to release. The Last Whaler has taken 2 years, and it's just different way that the different publishers operate. Uh, so the Last Whaler is about a couple, Tor and Astrid Handeland. He's a beluga whaler. She is a botanist, and they've lost a son. And he does his whaling in a remote fjord on Svalbard, and he typically leaves every summer to do this. After they lose their son, she convinces him to let them go together this particular year. She happens to be an expert on Arctic flora. So there is additional motivation to uh, accompany him. and to see up close this flora she'd only been studying, through books. And so they return, or they go to Svalbard in the summer of 1936. And it doesn't turn out to be the idyll that she especially expected. I'll leave it at that.
Why did you choose to write an historical fiction book set in Svalbard?
I had been I had applied for a residency. There's a residency sponsored by an organization, Arctic Circle, and their website is arcticcircle.org for anybody who's interested. You applied. They have 2 residencies a year, one in June and one in October. And you go with 32 other artists and scientists aboard a ship that starts in Longyearbyen, which is the main town on Svalbard. And you, using that ship, either dock at the few docks there are. One is in a place called New Alesund, which is a scientific research station, and another is in Pyramiden, which is an abandoned Russian coal mining town. There's also Barentsburg has a dock, although we didn't go there. It's also a Russian coal mining town. And the other are landings that you do where the ship anchors, and you take a Zodiac, which is a small motorized raft-like craft, and you go and beach that and explore whatever the beach, the landing is. Toward the end of that trip, we landed on a beach that was, for as far as the eye could see, covered with piles and piles of beluga bones. And for some of the artists on the ship in particular, it was very disturbing to see. For me, it was disturbing, but it was also interesting to think about how those bones got there. There was a shack called Bamsabu, which was, or turned out to be, what little I knew of it, the home of a beluga whaler in the 30s. There is a paragraph written about him, and that's all I knew. So I essentially made up a story around him to explore certain ideas, such as how pristine landscapes become defiled by human intervention, how whales were first exploited, but also even in the 30s began to be protected. The intelligence of the whale as a creature was interesting. The idea of botany on Svalbard, a lot of folks might think that the Arctic doesn't have a lot of vegetation, but in fact it has something like 150 different kinds of plants. So that's what spurred me to write it, and that started in 2017. I finished writing it in 2021, and some of it is some of the delay in writing was that I knew absolutely nothing about whaling, botany, Svalbard, other than what I experienced there during that trip. And World War II, Norway was an important aspect of the novel. So I did all of that research, but I also returned several times, both to Norway, where the couple originates from, and then to Svalbard, both to do additional research. There were libraries there that had documents that you couldn't find anywhere else, but also just to get a feeling. I was very interested in what it felt like, because I had been there in the summer originally when the day was 24 hours long, and I wanted to experience the transition into the Arctic dark season, where it's 24 hours of night. And then I also wanted to be there in the spring, what they call Soldagen, when the light begins to return. And so I made several trips there to experience that firsthand. And all of those experiences make their way into the novel, especially into the setting.
Now, before I go to the next question, I'm gonna mention that Svalbard is an island archipelago in the well above the Arctic Circle, and it's under Norwegian sovereignty, but there are Russian uh, mining towns because of a treaty between the two countries.
Right. The Svalbard Treaty of 1925 allowed, it's kind of a unique area. It's about 560 miles north of the northern coast of Norway, between that and the North Pole. It's at where Longyearbyen is the 78th parallel, if that means anything to those listening. A lot of their artifacts, their tote bags and whatnot have that. The 78 degrees is important. But in any event, yes, Svalbard is has a unique place, even though it is overseen by Norway. They have their own governance. They have a governor who runs the place, and they are subject to some Norwegian laws, but it's interesting. You can live there as long as you have a job, and you do not need a visa to live there. However, you do need visas to transit through, for example, Norway or Sweden, or however you get there. So if you're there for more than 3 months, you would need a visa to come and go, let's just say. But it is the Russians, the Swedes. I think last I heard, there were 40 different countries currently represented in the population there, which is about 2,000 permanent residents. It swells, particularly in the summer. Huge cruise ships dock, much to the dismay of some of the local residents, and unload, and so forth. So it gets more populous in the summer. But generally speaking, it's a pretty quiet town, and just an interesting town because there are people from all over the world living there.
Goldwake Press is the publisher of Falling Through the New World, but Regal House Publishing is the publisher of The Last Whaler. Why did you use different publishing companies for each of your books?
That's a good question. Well, Regal House accepted The Last Whaler first, and I hadn't actually sent The Last Whaler to many places before it got accepted. In fact, I think I sent it maybe to 3 or 4 places before it got accepted by Regal House. And I liked Regal House because it's a woman-run independent press, and the people there seemed very professional, and they published 36 books a year and so forth. They had a very good reputation. Goldwake Press, Falling Through the New World was actually harder to place. I'd say I sent it out to about a dozen places before Goldwake took it. They're a much smaller press. I think they publish 2 or 3 books a year, including one of my favorite books of the last few years called Oblivion by Robin Hemley. And so I was aware of them both through that, and also 10 years ago, I had done a panel with Kyle McCord, who's their executive editor. I had actually sent the book through a contest to Regal House, and it didn't win the contest. But by the time I thought about sending it to them in their regular process, I had already been accepted by Goldwake. So that was why it's just in two different presses. They're both independent presses, both very well run. Um, Goldwake, being the smaller press, was able to move the book through production much faster than Regal House.
I have time for a couple more questions. Why is research such an important part of your fiction writing process? And if you have an established research process, what is that like for you?
That is a good question. Um, I hate to admit that I actually prefer research to writing. Research is a more defined process. Uh, you pick up a book, you read it, you take notes, you get to the end, you think about how that might generate ideas for your work, but you're not facing a blank screen with the cursor, blinking at you. You have um, much more control over the research process than you do over the writing process. And I think that that is partially the nerd in me just loves learning about things I know nothing about. And I also find no matter what ideas I've had, and I'm not really sure why this is, but I can't think of a story I've written that was purely imaginative without some sort of personal history or formal research that informed the story. Uh, so those are the reasons why I think research is an important part of my writing. I also feel that through research, you find you look at one book and you look at the back of the book and the bibliography and you find something else and you just keep going down different rabbit holes. But often you'll find something, for example, while I was in Svalbard at this place called the Gallery Svalbard, which no longer exists. They've moved the gallery to the center of Longyearbyen, and it's now called Nordover. But the library had books and artifacts that were only available there, often in Norwegian. And so I would sit in that library and read a document that I couldn't find anywhere else, often about obscure people um, whose lives nevertheless matter and mattered to someone. And so I enjoy elevating those ordinary people into my work and describing those kinds of existences, the hunter, the female hunter in the south of Svalbard who um, made a life there every summer, for example, or the Norwegian woman who goes with her hunter husband to become an Arctic housewife. Those sorts of things just really fascinate me. And to be able to write about them, to bring them alive in my work, and particularly in The Last Whaler, I think this is true. It's probably the most historical fiction of my historical fictions. Falling to the New World doesn't have any historical figures in it, but The Last Whaler does. So that's the other big reason that I enjoy doing research as a way to springboard my fiction.
What are the best and worst pieces of writing advice you've ever received?
Well, the worst piece was the piece that almost stopped Falling Through the New World in its tracks, which was not to write a novel in stories. And I have to say that I am stubborn and didn't listen to that advice. The best piece was probably from a writer friend of mine who was also an advisor during my MFA program. And given the difficulty of getting published, of having your work seen, he said to consider yourself published if one other person read your work. So even when I was going through the MFA, if a teacher looked at a story, however rough, I could consider it published. And I thought that was a really hopeful way of attacking, let's say, the publishing aspect of this profession, because it can be extremely discouraging. The number of rejections you get compared to acceptances uh, can discourage writers entirely from pursuing the craft.
Cynthia, I thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus. You were an amazing and fascinating guest.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Cynthia was an amazing guest, and I hope to read her book soon. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your passion. Bye for now. Remember to subscribe to the Apollo Papyrus YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@Apollo Papyrus and the Apollo Papyrus Substack newsletter at apollopapyrus.substack.com. Y'all can visit the Apollo Papyrus website at campaaronapollo.witsite.com/Apollo Papyrus and follow Apollo Papyrus on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Apollo Papyrus. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.